If you look at the Cuban economy, it is basically in disarray. It's grown about 1.3% in the last decade, and if you look at the reason why, it's because almost all of its historic sources of foreign currency are currently depressed. For example, Cuba used to be the world's largest exporter of sugar. Do you want to guess how much sugar they've exported this year to date? 0. Part of that was because of the devastation caused by Hurricane Irma in Oriente, which is an agricultural region in Cuba. Part of it was because of horrendous land management techniques. For example, there is widespread erosion and weathering. There's salination of the groundwater. 14% of the arable land in this island is desertified, which is quite the feat in a subtropical country. And then you have the case of Marabu, which is an invasive Japanese houseplant which has run absolutely rampant, covering thousands of hectares of arable land. It's very, very difficult to get rid of. Then there's nickel and cobalt, which were historically the most important mineral exports in Cuba. However, the global commodities market is currently depressed, also depressing those prices. Then there's, Venezuelan oil. Venezuela used to send a very large amount of subsidized oil to Cuba. Cuba would then turn around and resell that oil at the market rate on the global market, of course, therefore netting itself a nice profit. However, with the economic and political implosion of Venezuela, those subsidized shipments have dropped precipitously. As a result, we now have rolling blackouts in Havana and other cities in Cuba. Cuba also used to export, and this is weird to think of people as exports, but they used to export doctors to many other countries, but most specifically to Venezuela and Brazil. Like I've said, Venezuela's economy has imploded. It obviously now imports far less doctors than it used to. Brazil is going through its own economic troubles, and as a result, it likewise is importing significantly less doctors. That leaves tourism, which is basically the only sector of the economy keeping the rest of it afloat. And that sector is intrinsically tied to the private sector. Currently, there are 567,000 individuals directly employed in the Cuban private sector. That's about 13% of the working population. However, if you include their families, those indirectly employed, and those employed in the so-called gray zone of the market, then you've got about 50% of the working population employed in the private sector. Many of these individuals work in paladares, which are independently owned restaurants, casas particulares, which are B&Bs. You've got people working as shoe shiners, bici taxis, kiosk owners, and of course, sex workers. You would think that the Cuban government, knowing how important this sector is to the overall health of the economy, would do everything in its power to foster this sector. But you'd be wrong. The private sector faces myriad challenges internally. For example, say you are a Cuban coder or website developer, of which there are actually quite a few on the app. What do you do to do your work? Well, you have to grab your laptop and go to a public Wi-Fi hotspot, usually located outdoors in a park. Remember, this is in a country where it constantly rains. You open up your laptop, you log on as quickly as possible, you download your instructions, and log back on. Then you go back to your office, work offline throughout the day, return at the end of the day to the park, log on, upload your work product, log back off, and do it again the next day. The reason for this is that it is prohibitively expensive to log online in Cuba. It costs about $1.25 an hour, and this is in a country where the average worker earns $25 a month. Moreover, Cuba has one of the slowest internet speeds in the entire world. Meanwhile, the Cuban legal system does not recognize those individuals working in the private sector, cuentapropistas, their entities, their businesses, as legal entities. So So what does that mean? That means as a private business person, you can't, for instance, divvy up shares. You can't accept foreign investment. You can't export without using the government-controlled export entity. And as a result, obviously, you suffer. So there are exactly 201 individual categories under which you can operate as a private business person. Like I said, they include nail salon, hairstylist, shoe shiner, seamstress, yes. But they don't include any of the professional services. So if you are an architect, an engineer, if you're a lawyer, you can't start your own firm. You can only work for the state. And as a result, you earn far, far less money. Making matters worse is the fact that last year, the Cuban government instituted a license freeze. So if you want to start a new business in Cuba, you're a Cuban citizen, you can't do so. The tax code, meanwhile, is purposefully designed to mitigate against wealth accumulation. This is, after all, a communist country. Say you want to buy and you have 10 tables. You might be taxed at a rate of 40%. But if business is going well and you want to increase to 25 tables, that rate might rise to 70% or above. And Cuba has really been cracking down on rule breakers as of late. Then you have what's basically a demographic time bomb. You have a large population of retirees or soon-to-be retirees, and you have a shrinking base of workers to support them. And remember, this is a socialist or communist country, so there's a huge social safety net to support them. The reason that we have this situation, the reason why Cuba has a developed country problem with a developing country economy is because of its very low birth rate and its very high rate of immigration, specifically among the working population. So Cuba is already suffering the consequences of this, and it will only get worse with time. And finally, you have the fact that there is no wholesale market in Cuba. If you want to buy in bulk as a business person, you have to do it at the retail level, making it much more expensive. However, there's always ways to resolver, to get around this. You took that. The Cubans made it up, not me or you. But, so basically, for instance, I don't know if you knew this, but the force of gravity is actually substantially stronger in Cuba than it is in the United States. So things tend to fall off the backs of trucks at a much higher rate there. So those are the internal obstacles to sustainable growth, specifically in the private sector. When it comes to the external, I'm going to focus, unsurprisingly, on U.S. policy. Cuba lies 90 miles offshore the United States. So geographically speaking, at least, this makes the two countries obvious trading partners. However, the embargo severely circumscribes U.S. citizens' ability to trade with or travel to Cuba. Currently, you need to fall under one of 12 categories. Rosa Maria can tell you more about this, in order to travel to Cuba as a U.S. citizen. They include, religious, sports, journalistic, that they don't strictly include tourists. So you cannot travel to Cuba just to hang out on the beach. You can't do it. President Trump's administration got rid of one of those subcategories, known as individual people-to-people travel. Previously, U.S. citizens could travel to Cuba under independently designed, again, people-to-people exchange programs. The rationale for getting rid of this was that it was largely unregulated, and it was unknown whether these individuals would just be going to a government-run resort, therefore netting the Cuban government illegal revenue. The hope being that you would push those U.S. travelers away from the government and toward the private sector. However, the exact opposite is what has occurred. So, again, unless you fall into one of those 12 categories, usually what happens is that you have to contract with a Cuban government-run tour agency. That means much more often than not, you stay at a government-run hotel, you patronize government-run restaurants, and you go to government-run entertainment venues. This is not in all circumstances, obviously. It's by and large the case. And what suffers, therefore, is the Cuban private sector. Making matters worse is the fact that U.S. travelers, by and large, patronize the private sector at a much higher rate than travelers from other countries who just like to go there for the resorts. Compounding all of this is the so-called acoustic attacks I'm sure you've heard of that occurred last year. I'm not going to go into the details, but suffice it to say that the FBI has concluded its investigation and has stated that it does not believe that the Cuban government perpetrated these incidents. Nevertheless, the United States removed the majority of its diplomatic staff from its embassy in Havana and kicked out the majority of the Cuban staff in their embassy in D.C. As a result, it is more difficult for U.S. travelers to go to Cuba or Cuban travelers to come to the United States simply because there isn't the consular staff to process their paperwork. Finally, this brings us to trade. Under the U.S. embargo, you can only, as a U.S. citizen, export, medical devices, agricultural products, infrastructure equipment, and humanitarian goods to Cuba. That means that for many Cuban business persons, they have to physically fly to Miami or some other city and fill their suitcases up with the supplies that they need to run their businesses before returning back. Not exactly the best supply chain. But, as I've stated, with the contraction of the diplomatic staff at these two embassies, that has become far more difficult. The U.S. State Department, meanwhile, created a blacklist of government-affiliated entities with which no U.S. citizen can do business. This is by no means an exhaustive list. There are many organizations that are affiliated with the state security apparatus or the military that did not make it on. Nevertheless, all these changes in regulations has caused significant confusion among U.S. travelers and businesses seeking to go to Cuba. And as a result, it is the Cuban people that have fared worse for it. That concludes my talk. Are there any questions?